Gerrit Dirkmaat on Joseph Smith's happiness letter. A response by Dan Vogel.
Happiness is the object and design of our existence, and will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it. And this path is virtue, uprightness, faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all the commandments of God. But we cannot keep all the commandments without first knowing them, and we cannot expect to know all, or more than we now know, unless we comply with or keep those we have already received. That which is wrong under one circumstance, may be, and often is, right under another. God said thou shalt not kill. At another time he said thou shalt utterly destroy. This is the principle on which the government of heaven is conducted, by revelation adapted to the circumstances in which the children of the kingdom are placed. Whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is, although we may not see the reason thereof till long after the events transpire.
These words come from a letter allegedly written by Joseph Smith in 1842, probably around April, to 19-year-old Nancy Rigdon, the daughter of his first counselor, Nancy Rigdon. The letter aims to persuade her to become one of his plural wives. It follows what is known as the divine command theory of morality. Essentially, it suggests that certain actions, usually considered immoral, are not immoral if God commands them, which was likely intended to address Nancy's hesitations. The first line from what is known as the happiness letter, that is, happiness is the object and design of our existence, has been quoted from Volume 5 of the History of the Church by many LDS leaders, often without awareness of its source. This letter does not appear in Joseph Smith's letter books or among his papers. It was initially published in 1842 by John C. Bennett, who had recently been excommunicated for practicing polygamy, referred to at the time as spiritual wifery. In 1855, those compiling Joseph Smith's official history included the letter without providing an explanation for its inclusion. Polygamy skeptics question both Joseph Smith's authorship of the letter and his alleged proposal to Nancy. I addressed the skepticism surrounding the proposal in a previous video. In this video, I will focus on the skepticism regarding the happiness letter, particularly as discussed in a 2016 article published in the Journal of Mormon History by LDS historian Gerrit Dirkmaat. Although Dirkmaat does not dispute Smith's practice of polygamy, some polygamy skeptics have embraced his article anyway. So my response has a twofold purpose. It should be noted at the outset that Dirkmaat says he does not definitively deny Joseph Smith's authorship of the letter.
It is not the intent of this article to make a definitive claim that Joseph Smith did not author the happiness letter, nor that he did not make a polygamous proposal to Nancy Rigdon. Still, the purpose of this article is to illustrate the difficulties involved in any attempt to gain a clear understanding of this document and to outline the reasons to both doubt and to impute Smith's authorship of the document. Rather than attributing it casually and definitively to Joseph Smith, historians and theologians, Mormons and non-Mormons alike, should be aware of the questioned provenance when using the document and draw measured rather than expansive conclusions. Simply put, if this were any other document, historians would greatly question the claims of authorship for the reasons that will follow.
Although Dirkmaat claims to offer a balanced evaluation of the evidence, he primarily emphasizes reasons to doubt Joseph Smith's authorship of the letter, while overlooking evidence that support its authenticity. In this response, I will critically assess his arguments, which are not always well-founded, and present reasons for acknowledging Joseph Smith as the author of the letter. The story begins in early April 1842, when Joseph Smith had already taken about 10 plural wives, possibly including Miranda Nancy Hyde, the wife of Apostle Orson Hyde, who was away on a mission. Bennett reported in the Sangamo Journal dated the 15th of July, 1842, that on the 9th of April, at Ephraim Mark's funeral, Miranda requested Nancy to visit her residence for a meeting with Joseph Smith. However, Joseph Smith didn't show up. Instead, Willard Richards, his scribe, appeared and rescheduled the meeting for Thursday, April 14th. When Joseph Smith met with Nancy to propose marriage, Nancy declined and subsequently informed her family. Before her departure, however, Joseph Smith assured Nancy that he would soon write to her. In a day or two, Richards delivered the letter. Bennett later provided a transcription in his 3rd of August 1842 correspondence to the Sangamo Journal, which was published on the 19th of August. Concerning this letter, Bennett stated in his book, History of the Saints, published later the same year,
"In a day or two, Dr. Richards handed her the following letter from the prophet Joe, written by Richards by Joe's dictation, and requested her to burn it after reading. The original, of which the above is a literal copy, in the handwriting of Dr. Richards, is now in my possession. It was handed me by Colonel Francis M. Higbee, in the presence of General George W. Robinson."
Bennett claimed that he received his copy from two men who were close to Nancy. 22-year-old Francis Higbee, who was courting her at the time, and her brother-in-law, George W. Robinson, neither of whom objected to their names being used. The Rigdon family expressed dissatisfaction with Joseph Smith after Nancy informed them of the situation. An entry in Joseph Smith's journal, recorded by Richards on the 29th of April, indicates that information about the proposal was starting to spread.
"There was made manifest a conspiracy against the peace of his household."
The initials JCB, inserted by Richards in different ink, indicate that Bennett was involved in the conspiracy to disrupt Joseph Smith's household, principally his wife. Another entry for the 12th of May reads,
"Dictated a letter to President Rigdon concerning certain difficulties or surmises which existed."
Why would Joseph Smith write a letter to Rigdon instead of just knocking on his door? Obviously, Smith was at the center of those difficulties or surmises, which he was careful not to specify in his journal. The next day, Smith received answer from Sidney Rigdon, wherein he probably agreed to have a meeting later that evening. The entry for the 13th of May reads,
"Walked in the evening to the post office with the recorder, Willard Richards, and had a private interview with President Rigdon with much apparent satisfaction to all parties concerning certain evil reports put in circulation by Francis M. Higbee about President Rigdon's family and others."
At this time, Rigdon was Nauvoo's postmaster, and the post office was located in his home, which he shared with his son-in-law, George W. Robinson, who had married Sidney's oldest daughter, Athalia. When Richards fleshed out this entry in the history draft in April 1845, he wrote,
"Received a letter from Sidney Rigdon in reply to mine of yesterday. In the evening, I walked with Elder Richards to the post office, and had an interview with Elder Rigdon concerning certain evil reports put in circulation by Francis M. Higbee about some of Elder Rigdon's family and others. Much apparent satisfaction was manifested at the conversation by Elder Rigdon."
Richards clarified some things in the journal entry, but not others. The reference to some of Elder Rigdon's family refers to Nancy instead of the whole Rigdon family, and the others, not of Rigdon's family, refers to Joseph Smith. That's why he was there. A clearer picture emerged a few months later when Bennett began publishing a series of letters in the Sangamo Journal. In the first letter, dated 27th of June, which was published on the 8th of July, he wrote,
"Joseph Smith attempted to seduce Miss Nancy Rigdon to submit to his hellish purposes, and become one of his clandestine wives under the new dispensation. Call upon Miss Rigdon, who repulsed him with commendable firmness, and I will abide her testimony. Call likewise upon General George W. Robinson and Colonel Francis M. Higbee to state what they know upon this subject. General Robinson and Colonel Higbee can tell some astounding facts in relation to this matter. Joe approached Miss Rigdon in the name of the Lord, and by his authority and permission, as he said. Joe attacked Mr. Rigdon, General Robinson, Colonel Higbee, and myself, in order to destroy the influence of all of us to prevent the exposition of this case."
Meanwhile, it appears hard feelings between Joseph Smith and the Rigdons were rekindled. On the 28th of June, Joseph Smith, accompanied by Bishop George Miller, met with the Rigdon family to discuss the matter. In his second letter, dated 2nd of July, and published in the Sangamo Journal on the 15th of July, Bennett reported,
"On Tuesday last, Joe came up to Mr. Rigdon's, accompanied by his high priest, George Miller, for a witness, and by boisterous words and violent gestures tried to deny the attempted seduction and alarm the girl. But she told him he was a cursed liar, and that he could not face her to it. Joe then made a full acknowledgment of the whole affair. All the family and many other persons were present. The holy George observed, "You must not harm the Lord's anointed. The Lord will not suffer his anointed to fall. Now call upon Miss Rigdon for the truth of the foregoing."
Note that Bennett named his sources openly, apparently without fear of contradiction. This explains why no denials were issued. Joseph Smith will later attack the characters of those involved in accusing him, including Nancy's, but he never denied making the proposal. This is important because it determines who has the most credibility when it comes to the letter's authorship. An entry in Joseph Smith's journal for the 28th of June tells a different story.
President Joseph, in company with Bishop Miller, visited Elder Rigdon and his family, and had much conversation about John C. Bennett and others. Much unpleasant feeling was manifested by Elder Rigdon's family, who were confounded and put to silence by the truth from President Joseph.
Dirkmaat mentions the conflicting stories as if they carry equal weight. They don't. He states,
Even if Smith's authorship is assumed, however, Bennett's claim placing it in the context of a failed proposal to Nancy Rigdon also cannot be demonstrated with certainty, as there are competing accounts of the interactions between the two of them.
while conflicting accounts exist, this alone does not necessarily introduce uncertainty. Historians must assess the credibility of the sources involved. Dirkmaat assigns equal weight to Joseph Smith's private and unverified account, and Bennett's published narrative, which cites multiple witnesses. On the 27th of July, 1842, Nancy's brother-in-law, George W. Robinson, wrote to James Arlington Bennett in New York and recounted the story, beginning with Smith's indecent proposal.
She left him with disgust, and came home and told her father of the transaction, upon which Smith was sent for. He came. She told the tale in the presence of all the family, and to Smith's face. I was present. Smith attempted to deny it at first, and face her down with a lie, but she told the facts with so much earnestness, and the fact of a letter being present, which he had caused to be written to her, on the same subject, the day after the attempt made on her virtue, breathing the same spirit, and which he had fondly hoped was destroyed, all came with such force that he would not withstand the testimony, and he then and there acknowledged that every word of Miss Rigdon's testimony was true.
According to Robinson, Smith confessed that he had proposed to Nancy, but that he was merely testing Nancy's virtue.
Now for his excuse, which he made for such a base attempt, and for using the name of the Lord in vain. On that occasion, he wished to ascertain whether she was virtuous or not, and took that course to learn the facts.
To maintain this highly unlikely explanation, Smith needed to deny authorship of the letter. Smith's need to keep his polygamous activities secret explains his denial of proposing to Nancy, his changing his story, and his continued denial of authoring the letter. In this context, selectively supporting or accepting Smith's denial of authoring the letter does not align with the overall circumstances. Apparently, Joseph Smith believed his cover story of testing Nancy confounded and put to silence the Rigdon family. Robinson, however, didn't believe it. Neither did Nancy. In another letter to John C. Bennett, dated 8th of August, 1842, Robinson said,
Nancy don't like to be called into the field to say anything about her case herself, but says I may mention it, which I shall most assuredly do.
Understandably, Nancy, as the daughter of Joseph Smith's first counselor, was reluctant to participate in the public discussion of the matter. Nancy's brother John was 12 at the time and gave several statements during his lifetime about what he witnessed. Following an interview with John, the Salt Lake Tribune reported on the 20th of May, 1900,
Mr. John Rigdon then went on to say that Joseph Smith made a proposition of plural or spiritual marriage to his, Rigdon's, sister Nancy. The proposition was indignantly refused by the young lady. She at once told her father, Sidney Rigdon, of Smith's proposal. The elder Rigdon was very angry, and called Smith to account. 2 or 3 days afterward, Smith called at the Rigdon home and attempted to deny the statement of Miss Nancy, when she promptly told the prophet that he was a liar and a scoundrel if he intimated that he had not made the proposition. Mr. Rigdon said yesterday that he was present at this interview, and remembers the circumstances as distinctly as though it had occurred only last week. After this interview, Mr. Rigdon said Smith acknowledged to his father that he had proposed plural marriage to his daughter, and begged forgiveness. Sidney Rigdon pardoned the offense, and the prophet and his first counselor became good friends again.
So it's untrue that conflicting accounts have created uncertainty. Joseph Smith never issued an alternate version of what happened, at least not publicly. Instead, on the 27th of July, the Wasp, a newspaper edited by Joseph Smith's brother William, issued an extra containing several affidavits responding to Bennett's letters by smearing the reputations of not only Nancy Rigdon, but also Martha Brotherington and Melissa Schindel. This 4-page extra was aggressively distributed throughout the country. On the same day, in the regular issue of the Wasp, William Smith denied that Joseph Smith was the letter's author.
The 6th letter is what purports to be a copy of a letter from Joseph Smith to Miss Nancy Rigdon, without date, name, or proof. But we hope the community are not yet quite so far from a common course of justice and propriety as to take Bennett's word for the truth or fallacy of the curious thing. Joseph Smith is not the author.
Of course, no one had to take Bennett's word for the letter's provenance. He obtained the document from Nancy through Higby and Robinson, none of whom disputed Bennett's account. Moreover, Robinson corroborated the existence of the letter in his correspondence with James Arlington Bennett, noting that it was used to confront Smith. William, a future polygamist, was deeply involved in the cover-up, referring to the 3 young women as harlots. He couldn't find any of the participants who would deny Joseph Smith's proposal to Nancy or the claim that he had confessed to the Rigdon family. The letter was easier to deny, however, since it wasn't signed and wasn't written in Smith's handwriting. It would have been easy for William to get Richards to sign an affidavit denying he had written the letter or that he had delivered it to Nancy on Joseph Smith's behalf, if such had been the case. William and Richards knew that, if challenged, Bennett could produce the letter. The best William could do was to obtain an oddly worded statement from Sidney Rigdon, which was included in the 27th of August Wasp Extra and again in the regular Wasp on the 3rd of September.
Dear Sir, I am fully authorized by my daughter Nancy to say to the public through the medium of your paper that the letter which has appeared in the Sangamo Journal, making part of General Bennett's letters to said paper, purporting to have been written by Mr. Joseph Smith to her, was unauthorized by her, and that she never said to General Bennett or any other person that said letter was written by said Mr. Smith, nor in his handwriting, but by another person, and in another person's handwriting. She further wishes me to say that she never at any time authorized General Bennett to use her name in the public papers, as he has done, which has been greatly to the wounding of her feelings, and she considers the obtruding of her name before the public in the manner in which it has been done, to say the least of it, as a flagrant violation of the rules of gallantry, and cannot avoid to insult her feelings, which she wishes the public to know. I would further state that Mr. Smith denied to me the authorship of that letter.
Dirkmaat exaggerates when he claims Rigdon's letter to the Wasp refuted Bennett's claim that Smith was the author. That's not accurate. He didn't refute anything. He merely repeated Joseph Smith's denial, which distances himself from it. Mr. Smith denied to me the authorship of that letter, he said. Notably, he didn't say he believed Smith. He likely had some doubts about Smith's denial, especially given that Smith initially lied about proposing to Nancy. It's also important to note that Rigdon didn't deny that Joseph Smith proposed to Nancy, and Nancy didn't deny Joseph Smith wrote the happiness letter, only that it wasn't written in his handwriting, which Bennett never claimed. So the statement isn't just cryptic, as Dirkmaat describes, but rather misleading and useless. As previously mentioned, Joseph Smith's denial of authorship is not surprising, since the letter's existence corroborated Nancy's account. It also contradicted Joseph Smith's claim that he had proposed to her to test her virtue, so continued denial of authoring the letter was necessary. This denial, however, should be treated with the same skepticism as his claim that he was only testing Nancy. So Rigdon's statement is weak evidence against Joseph Smith's authorship of the letter. Rather, Rigdon's statement confirmed that such a letter existed, which had come into Nancy's possession independent of Bennett. Despite this rather obvious observation, Dirkmaat questions the provenance of the letter.
How and when Bennett obtained the letter is not entirely clear, nor can his declaration of provenance be verified. Writing his second letter to the Sangamo Journal from Carthage, Illinois, on July 2, 1842, only days after the confrontation between the Rigdons and Smith occurred over the Bennett allegations, Bennett referenced the letter but said that he did not have it in his possession. He stated that he had seen it, so has her father, and various other persons.
In his 2nd of July letter, Bennett reported,
Joe agreed to write her, and did so in a few days, through Dr. Richards. That letter is now safe in the hands of her friends. I have seen it, so has her father and various other persons.
We have seen that Sidney Rigdon verified that his daughter had received the letter, and George Robinson verified that the letter was present at the 28th of June meeting with Smith. Despite this fact, Dirkmaat tries to cast doubt on the provenance of the letter by questioning Bennett's account of obtaining possession of it. He asserts that the locations and dates on Bennett's letters to the Sangamo Journal indicate that Bennett could not have gotten the letter from Higbee because he was moving around too much in July. Thus, he argues,
on July 2nd, he did not have the letter in his possession, and during a month of nearly constant traveling in which he was not in one location for more than a week at a time, it would have been nearly impossible for the letter or a copy of it to have found him by the regular mail.
This assumes he didn't make a copy of it when he first saw it, and that he later got possession of the original. However, the letter was not transferred to Bennett through the mail, but was hand-delivered, which Dirkmaat acknowledges. So why even give this argument? In his letters published in the Sangamo Journal, Bennett didn't say how he got his copy of the happiness letter, but in his book published later the same year, he wrote,
The original, of which the above is a literal copy, in the handwriting of Dr. Richards, is now in my possession. It was handed to me by Colonel Francis M. Higbee, in the presence of General George W. Robinson.
So, as I said, the letter didn't come through the mail, but was handed to Bennett. But Dirkmaat inconsistently argues,
for this face-to-face meeting between the three men to have occurred, in which the letter was transferred, it could only have come after Bennett wrote his July 2nd letter from Carthage, but before he left for Missouri a few days later.
We know that Bennett wrote his 2nd and 3rd letters on the 2nd and 4th of July from Carthage, Illinois, which was only 22 miles from Nauvoo, and that his 4th letter was written from St. Louis on the 15th of July. He was still in Carthage when he swore out an affidavit against Porter Rockwell on the 7th of July. Francis Higbee wrote to him on the 6th of July and said,
I think I will be out of Carthage to see you soon. Come in as soon as you can, but do not stay here long or overnight.
Carthage was only 3 to 4 hours away by horse. It is therefore conceivable that there could have been a meeting of the three men before Bennett left for Missouri, either in Nauvoo or Carthage. Still, Bennett may have used a copy of the letter for the Sangamo Journal, but procured the original later before the publication of his book in late October. It seems probable that Higbee and Robinson were planning to make such a trip to Carthage. The day before Higbee mentioned his intention to do so, Robinson wrote to Bennett and said,
The letter to Miss Nancy Rigdon. Colonel Chauncey L. Higbee will get. Colonel Francis M. Higbee has it, and I told him to get it.
So Dirkmaat's argument is weak. Indeed, it makes little sense to question Bennett, given that he named the two individuals who transferred the letter to him, and the letter had verifiable existence before he received it. At this point, Dirkmaat engages in special pleading, demonstrating his lack of objectivity. Because it is difficult to dismiss the provenance Bennett gave for the letter, which he supported by including his correspondence with Higbee and Robinson, Dirkmaat tries to cast doubt on that evidence.
Bennett later published a letter attributed to George Robinson and addressed to himself in which Francis Higbee said he would get the letter, implying that it was not in the possession of either Robinson or Higbee on July 3, 1842. In another letter attributed to Robinson by Bennett and sent to James Arlington Bennett, the letter to Nancy Rigdon was again referenced, and Robinson reported that the letter was present and discussed when Smith and the Rigdons had their confrontation on June 28. However, as none of these letters can be independently verified, it is possible that Bennett, with or without the aid of Robinson, may have been deliberately trying to create a chain of custody of the letter by averring its existence and when and where it was acquired.
Dirkmaat contends that Robinson was either acting in bad faith by assisting Bennett in creating a provenance for the forged letter, or that Bennett fabricated Bennett's letter himself. It is extremely doubtful that both Robinson and James Arlington Bennett would have remained silent about the fraudulent use of their names. That leaves Dirkmaat's unfounded speculation about a conspiracy between the three men. This is an ad hoc hypothesis created solely to escape evidence that challenges Dirkmaat's preferred interpretation. It amounts to circular reasoning that begins with the assumption that Joseph Smith told the truth when he denied authorship of the letter. If Joseph Smith told the truth, then Bennett lied, then there must have been a conspiracy because Joseph Smith told the truth. Rather than inventing the hypothesis that Bennett fabricated the happiness letter, as well as his correspondence with Higbee and Robinson, as well as Robinson's correspondence with James Arlington Bennett, the simpler explanation is that Joseph Smith lied just like he did about the proposal to Nancy. Bennett probably obtained a copy of Robinson's 27th of July letter to James Arlington Bennett when he visited New York to speak publicly on Mormonism in mid-August 1842. We know that the two Bennetts met at Arlington House on Long Island on the 12th of August. In a letter to Smith dated 16th of August, James said John suggested that they team up to write the book, but he refused because he didn't know enough and didn't want to displease the Mormons. In his letter to Smith, he said,
General John C. Bennett called on me last Friday and spent just 2 hours when he left, as he said, for the eastern states.
The two Bennetts were well acquainted. On the 12th of April, 1842, John C. Bennett, before his excommunication, had appointed James Arlington Bennett as Inspector General of the Nauvoo Legion, with the rank of Major General. According to a lengthy report about Bennett's lecture published in the New York Herald on the following day, he read a long letter from General Robinson to General James Arlington Bennett about Joe Smith's trying to seduce Nancy Rigdon, General Robinson's wife's sister. It's unlikely that Bennett would read a forged letter addressed to James Arlington Bennett in public in New York City. A statement by James Gordon Bennett, no relation to James Arlington Bennett or John C. Bennett, in the New York Herald on the 30th of August implied that he and James Arlington Bennett were planning to attend John C. Bennett's lecture.
We shall see and hear and report what reasons General John C. Bennett can advance tonight in his discourse that may prevent us from standing by Joe Smith.
As officers in the Nauvoo Legion, they had been summoned to Nauvoo on the 4th of August to fill a vacancy left by John C. Bennett's departure. There is no chance that James Arlington Bennett would have allowed his name to be used to promote a false narrative. Rather, it is probable that John C. Bennett got his copy of the letter from him on the previous day. So Dirkmaat's ad hoc theory is totally without merit. Dirkmaat next argues,
proper source criticism requires Bennett's explanation of the provenance and context of the letter to be seen in a dubious light rather than being readily embraced by researchers.
No, it doesn't. The letter existed independent of Bennett. Evidence shows that the Rigdon family had the letter before Bennett obtained it. A forger wouldn't name his sources and allow them to contradict him. Neither Higbee nor Robinson complained about the use of their names, and Willard Richards never contradicted the claim that the letter was in his handwriting. Bennett's explanation of the provenance and context of the letter is therefore more likely to be true than not. Nevertheless, Dirkmaat does everything he can to raise suspicions and make his forgery theory seem possible.
First, the medium through which Bennett published the Happiness Letter was a Whig paper that had vociferously voiced its opposition to the Mormons, enraged at Mormon support for the Democratic gubernatorial candidate, Thomas Ford. It is important to note that Bennett's publication was injected into this highly partisan and bitter political struggle, thus giving the journal every reason to publish his letters and no reason to examine any of the documents or allegations critically.
This is nonsense. It implies that a nonpartisan paper would have fact-checked Bennett's letters, and if they had done so, would have refused to publish them. Is that realistic? What 19th century paper fact-checked? Besides, Bennett's letters were published in a range of newspapers with different viewpoints. This is not evidence that Bennett forged the letter.
Second, and more importantly, the purpose of Bennett's publications was to denounce Mormonism in general and Smith in particular.
Bennett's wanting to denounce Mormonism and Joseph Smith isn't proof that he forged the letter. At best, it shows he might have had the motive to exaggerate or distort the truth, but it doesn't prove he forged it. If there was strong evidence that the letter had been forged, which there isn't, then Bennett would be just one of several with a motive. If we're speculating that the happiness letter was forged, why not consider Robinson as the forger or Higbee? They also disliked Joseph Smith. What if Nancy forged the letter to support her account? After all, everything traces back to her, and Bennett was only the publisher. In any case, now that we have multiple candidates in our forgery speculation, bias alone is insufficient evidence, especially in this case. As I've explained, the stronger argument is that Willard Richards delivered the letter to Nancy, claiming it was from Joseph Smith. Dirkmaat then accuses Bennett of forging another Smith document, which includes a revelation and a signed cover letter. Bennett claimed Joseph Smith gave him this document in 1841 and told him not to open or read it unless he was dead. The revelation named his counselors in the first presidency, Hiram Smith and Sidney Rigdon, as his successors, thereby excluding Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. The revelation and letter were published in the Alton Telegraph and Democratic Review on the 21st of September, 1844, and reprinted in the LDS periodical, The Prophet, on the 10th of May, 1845, where Bennett was accused of forgery. Even if we conclude Bennett forged the 1841 revelation and letter in 1844, which seems likely, it doesn't mean he forged the happiness letter 2 years earlier. Dirkmaat acknowledges such to be the case.
Though this later forgery claiming provenance through Bennett is not directly linked to the Nancy Rigdon letter, its existence must be carefully weighed when considering the authenticity of the happiness letter. If Bennett, as it appears is almost certainly the case, forged a Smith document in one case, then trusting him as the sole source of a text purporting to be Smith's is extremely speculative, as it would be to trust any document provenanced by a known forger. If Bennett was willing to forge a letter in 1844, there is a strong likelihood that he would be willing to do so in 1842 as well.
No one accused Bennett of forging the letter at the time, and there was a good reason for this. The letter was said to be in the handwriting of Willard Richards, who had delivered it to Nancy. This claim was never challenged. Additionally, the letter also had an existence independent of Bennett and was transferred to him by Higbee and Robinson, which also went unchallenged. In fact, both men were in constant contact with Bennett during this time. Unlike the happiness letter, the forged 1844 revelation and letter lacked provenance and witnesses, relying solely on Bennett's claim. Additionally, the vocabulary and style of the forged revelation clearly indicate its inauthenticity, which cannot be said for the happiness letter. Even Dirkmaat admits the happiness letter is stylistically different than Bennett's 1844 revelation and letter. On this matter, he states,
and the letter does seem to resemble Joseph Smith's language more readily than Bennett's other forgeries, but this has not been proven in a quantitative, academic way.
What Bennett did 2 years later should not bias our judgment about the happiness letter. If the letter came solely from Bennett and we had to rely on his word, then Dirkmaat would be justified in using the 1844 forgeries as evidence that Bennett could have forged the happiness letter. One troubling omission in Dirkmaat's article is his failure to acknowledge evidence supporting Bennett's claim that the letter had been written by Willard Richards at Joseph Smith's dictation. In 2013, historian Devery Anderson published an article about Willard Richards, which provided a comparison between the happiness letter and passages from Richards' letter to his wife, dated 26th of February, 1842, about 2 months before the happiness letter. The letter seems to make veiled references to polygamy in language similar to the happiness letter. For example, compare the following passages.
There are many things recorded of the old patriarchs and prophets, which have seemed bad to us, which if we knew the reasons thereof, and the order of God, would appear right.
So with Solomon, first he asked wisdom, and God gave it him, and with it every desire of his heart, even things which might be considered abominable to all who do not understand the order of heaven only in part, but which, in reality, were right, because God gave and sanctioned by special revelation.
Consider also the following passages.
The grand secret of the gospel is this: for us to live by every word of the Lord, to live by revelation, present revelation, do what God requires of us, and not what he required of somebody else.
This is the principle on which the government of heaven is conducted, by revelation adapted to the circumstances in which the children of the kingdom are placed. Whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is, although we may not see the reason thereof till long after the events transpire.
Concerning these parallel passages, Devery Anderson wrote,
What these lines mean about the understanding between Richards and Janetta concerning polygamy is unclear, but they do make the existence of Smith's purported letter to Nancy Rigdon likely, especially since the letter was reported to have been in Richards's hand.
The similarities between the two letters are probably due to Joseph Smith's teaching Richards about polygamy before dictating the happiness letter to Richards. As Richards told Janetta,
Could I see you, I could explain many things I did not know when I left you.
no doubt things he had learned from Smith. Dirkmaat attempts to use Bennett's excommunication for sexual misconduct to question his credibility, because he initially denied but later confessed. However, as I maintain, this is irrelevant since he was only the publisher of the letter.
Further, though Bennett originally denied any infidelity and argued it had been Smith who was practicing spiritual wifery, and that he had withdrawn from the church on his own accord because his level of disgust had become too great, at a speaking engagement 2 years later he admitted that he had, in fact, been expelled for some indiscretions with a sister. A newspaper reported that Bennett had commenced by giving with remarkable candor and plainness the history of his amour with a gentle princess of Nauvoo. The Mormons, however, he declared, were themselves guilty of the very sin for which they had excommunicated him. Thus, Bennett had for years denied any sexual misconduct leading to his excommunication, but then later admitted he had indeed been involved in a sexual liaison with at least one woman in Nauvoo. This admission further imperils his credibility.
Of course, Dirkmaat ignores the issue of Joseph Smith's credibility. Smith publicly denied his involvement in polygamy while practicing it in secret on a much larger scale than Bennett ever did. At least Bennett came clean with his indiscretions. Clearly, Dirkmaat has a blind spot when it comes to Joseph Smith, which diminishes the value of his article. In fact, I would contend that it should be treated as an apologetic rather than a serious historical treatment of the subject. As mentioned, no one, not even Joseph Smith, denied that he had proposed to Nancy. Instead, church leaders launched a smear campaign against Bennett and anyone associated with him, including Nancy. On the 31st of August, 1842, the Times and Seasons issued a broadside containing affidavits and certificates disproving the statements and affidavits contained in John C. Bennett's letters, which included an affidavit by Stephen Markham attempting to implicate Nancy and Bennett in an unlawful and illicit intercourse because he had seen Bennett sitting near Nancy, who was in bed, and claimed to have heard many vulgar, unbecoming, and indecent sayings and motions pass between them. Dirkmaat accepts Markham's affidavit, despite its prompt rebuttal. Sidney Rigdon issued a statement denouncing Markham.
Markham is not to be believed, that his word for truth and veracity is not good, that he could not believe said Markham under oath, and that he did on a certain occasion testify under oath to that which deponent knows to be false, and he verily believes said Markham knew the same to be false while testifying.
According to George Robinson,
Mr. Rigdon has employed a lawyer, Calvin A. Warren, Esquire, to prosecute Markham on his affidavit. Nancy stands firm in the cause of virtue and opposes Joe to the last.
other acquaintances of Nancy came forward and testified to her virtue and good character. George Robinson also denounced Markham in a notarized affidavit dated the 3rd of September, 1842.
Having been acquainted with Stephen Markham of the city of Nauvoo for many years, I can safely say that his character for truth and veracity is not good, and that I could not believe him under oath, and that I am personally knowing of his lying, and that his character in general is that of a loafer, disturber of the peace, liar, etc., and that he did come into the house of Sidney Rigdon, as stated in his affidavit, and that Dr. Bennett and Miss Rigdon were present, as well as myself, and that Miss Rigdon was then sick, and Dr. John C. Bennett was the attending physician, and I do further state that no such conversation or gestures as said Markham states took place or came under my observation, and I do further believe that said Markham did invent, concoct, and put in circulation said stories with a malicious design and intent to injure the character of Miss Rigdon, and more particularly for the use of the elders who are going out preaching to rebut Dr. Bennett's statements, and further this deponent saith not.
William Smith also reported in the 3rd of September issue of the Wasp that Joseph Smith said,
"The affidavit of Stephen Markham, relative to Miss Nancy Rigdon, as published in the Handbill of Affidavits, was unauthorized by him."
Dirkmaat briefly mentions some of the objections to Markham's affidavit, but tries to rehabilitate it by linking it with Orson Hyde's 1845 statement.
Markham's questionable account was corroborated to a degree several years later, if still poorly evidenced. When writing his invective against Sidney Rigdon's claims to the leadership of the church in 1845, Apostle Orson Hyde provided a different explanation for the encounter between Smith and Nancy Rigdon. Hyde argued that the initial encounter between Nancy Rigdon and Smith was under radically different circumstances than those alleged by Bennett.
How can Markham's accusations be corroborated to a degree and poorly evidenced? That makes no sense. Hyde's 1845 statement doesn't corroborate Markham's accusations about Nancy and Bennett, but has serious credibility problems of its own. While denouncing Sidney Rigdon's claim to be Joseph Smith's successor, Hyde criticized him for taking his daughter's side against Joseph Smith.
During my absence to Palestine, the conduct of Rigdon's daughter, Nancy, became so notorious in this city, according to common rumor, she was regarded generally little, if any better than a public prostitute. Joseph Smith, knowing the conduct she was guilty of, felt anxious to reprove and reclaim her if possible. He, accordingly, requested my wife to invite her down to her house. He wished to speak with her and show her the impropriety of being gallantied about by so many different men, many of whom were comparatively strangers to her. Her own parents could look upon it and think that all was right, being blind to the faults of their daughter. There being so many of this kind of men visiting Mr. Rigdon's house at the steamboat landing, for he kept some sort of tavern or boarding house, that Mr. Smith did not care to go there to see her. Miss Nancy, I presume, considered her dignity highly insulted at the plain and sharp reproof she received from the servant of God. She ran home and told her father that Mr. Smith wanted her for a spiritual wife, and that he employed my wife to assist him in obtaining her. This was a good time for Miss Nancy and John C. Bennett to wreak vengeance on the victim of their hatred for his severe admonitions. Mr. Bennett, I think, was a boarder at Mr. Rigdon's at that time, and I am told was all honey with the whole family.
So Dirkmaat gives preference to hearsay over testimony of Bennett and his witnesses. Hyde was in Nauvoo at the time and could only repeat what others told him, whereas multiple witnesses heard Joseph Smith's confession. Hyde's account likely echoes Joseph Smith's initial claims about Nancy's alleged promiscuity, which her family and friends refuted. However, Markham hadn't accused Nancy of promiscuity, only of having an affair with Bennett. And Hyde didn't accuse Nancy of having an affair with Bennett. So Hyde didn't corroborate Markham's accusations at all. And neither source is independently credible. According to Hyde, Nancy falsely claimed Joseph Smith wanted her for a spiritual wife. He also denied Rigdon's claim that he had been excommunicated for opposing some kind of spiritual wife doctrine, or that he had beseeched him not to make any disclosures about the spiritual wife doctrine. He also declared, "Will the best and most blessed people on earth have spiritual wives and tolerate adultery?" These statements should be considered in the light that he was himself a polygamist. He then moves on to talk about Rigdon's difficulty with Joseph Smith involving his daughter.
Miss Nancy is made, therefore, to attribute to Joseph Smith and to my wife language which neither of them ever used. Thus must an innocent and unsuspecting female suffer for putting down a hand to help, as it is verily believed, a poor miserable girl out of the very slough of prostitution.
We now know Joseph Smith was a polygamist and that at some point Nancy Hyde had become one of his wives. So, despite Hyde's obfuscation, this was precisely the kind of language they would have used. Time has exonerated Nancy Rigdon, not Joseph Smith. Orson Hyde was lying for the Lord and was motivated by institutional need to deny polygamy. He then used that lie against Rigdon.
Here is now a curious case before us. Mr. Rigdon testified here on Sunday, the 4th of August last, before some thousands of witnesses, that the same man who, he says, tried to seduce his daughter is a true martyr, has ascended to heaven, and holds the keys of the kingdom. Can Mr. Rigdon believe that Joseph Smith ever tried to seduce his daughter? Can he believe that he ever tried to get her for a spiritual wife? If he really believes this of Mr. Smith, how could he propose to build up the kingdom to him unless he fellowshipped such abominable works? I do not, however, think Mr. Rigdon believes any such thing of Joseph Smith.
As mentioned, Hyde was at this time a polygamist and knew the truth about Joseph Smith, and this truth made it entirely plausible that Joseph Smith had proposed to Nancy. He could only make his argument against Rigdon by lying about Joseph Smith's involvement in polygamy, which was the church's official position at the time. Why didn't Dirkmaat use source criticism with Hyde's claims? When Hyde made his accusations about Nancy, he also denied Rigdon's claim that the church was secretly practicing polygamy, which he, as a polygamist, knew to be true. So, by Dirkmaat's reasoning, what Hyde said about Nancy can't be trusted. Regardless, multiple witnesses were present when Joseph Smith changed his story and confessed that he had proposed to Nancy, but that it was a test, which Smith never denied. Dirkmaat acknowledges that his use of Hyde is problematic.
Hyde's statement has often been discounted as a desperate and pejorative attack upon Nancy Rigdon's character for the purpose of discrediting her and her father and concealing polygamy. Indeed, as an apostle second only to Brigham Young in seniority in the quorum and one who was himself secretly practicing polygamy, Hyde had every reason to fabricate and embellish this explanation of the Nancy Rigdon episode to both defend Smith and solidify his own hold on power. It has also been observed that Hyde was not even in the country at the time of the first meeting between Smith and Nancy Rigdon or any of the subsequent fallout, and thus his story has been afforded little credibility.
So Dirkmaat's attempt to use Hyde to support Markham is weak. Still, he then tries to use Hyde's statement in a lengthy and fallacious argument from analogy and ad hominem circumstantial, arguing that the reasons for rejecting Hyde's statement also apply when assessing Bennett's statements.
But if historians apply these principles of negation to the evidence across the board, they would just as similarly disqualify Bennett's version of events.
No, they don't. Not at all. Hyde's statement can't be used against Bennett's account. There's no parity here. The difference is that Bennett had corroboration and named his sources, but Hyde only mentioned rumors and didn't give sources for his information. Subsequent disclosures about Nauvoo polygamy tend to support Bennett, Robinson, Higbee, and the Rigdons, but not Hyde. Yet Dirkmaat persists in his fallacious line of reasoning, much like a polemical apologist rather than a historian.
Bennett also had every reason to make his accusations against Smith. While Bennett, unlike Hyde, was present in Nauvoo at the time, his information on Smith's meeting with Nancy Rigdon, during which Bennett claimed Smith had attempted to seduce Nancy Rigdon, and the production and provenance of the letter was at best third-hand, according to Bennett's own statements.
Because neither Nancy nor Smith issued a statement, all statements are necessarily third hand, but that doesn't mean they are equally credible. Unlike Bennett, Hyde didn't identify his source or sources of information. Repeated rumors and falsely implied Joseph Smith wasn't a polygamist. Bennett, on the other hand, named Higby and Robinson as his sources, neither of whom objected to their names being used. Both claimed their information came from Nancy. Robinson said he heard Joseph Smith confess, which makes him an eyewitness. Bennett's claims are therefore far more credible than Hyde's.
Hyde's information about the purposes of the interview with Nancy Rigdon could have been readily relayed by his wife, Miranda, who was intimately involved in the entire scenario, according to Bennett's version of events.
Miranda Hyde never came forward to denounce Nancy's version, although there was a frantic effort to respond to Bennett's accusations. Hyde may have heard the story from his wife, who wasn't in the locked room with Nancy and Joseph Smith, so she would only be able to repeat what Joseph Smith told her before his confession, that is. The most likely reason Hyde didn't name his sources is because he knew he was lying and didn't want to implicate others. Dirkmaat continues.
If the events took place as Bennett claimed they did, then Orson Hyde would have had access to as much information from a principal actor as did Bennett.
That's not true. Hyde had limited information, possibly through his wife and rumors, while Bennett had access to Nancy through Higby and Robinson, along with Robinson's first-hand account of the confession. So the evidence levels are not equivalent, and Hyde wasn't in a position to tell the truth about Joseph Smith's proposal to Nancy since the church was still denying polygamy.
Hyde's statements should be critically analyzed and used with extreme hesitancy by historians, but prudence demands that this same level of source criticism should also be applied to Bennett's statements as well.
Source criticism for Hyde is difficult because he, unlike Bennett, gave no sources, and he wasn't being honest about Joseph Smith's polygamy. The two are not equivalent, and therefore it is not inconsistent to treat Bennett's evidence differently.
Both men had the incentive to manipulate the truth, and both had similar levels of access to information about the event.
Having the incentive to manipulate the truth and doing so are different things. Historians can't merely raise the possibility of something being the case. They have to make a probable case. Otherwise, it's the fallacy of possible proof or appeal to possibility. However, Dirkmaat has only raised the possibility that Bennett manipulated the truth, despite his having corroboration. But we know Hyde's response to Rigdon's accusations about polygamy was deceptive.
Both men had the testimony of others to corroborate at least part of their statements, but those witnesses were also similarly biased.
Again, Hyde didn't name any sources. Joseph Smith was dead, and Miranda had already missed her chance to exonerate Joseph Smith. But what could they say anyway, since we know Joseph Smith proposed marriage to lots of women? On the other hand, Bennett named his sources and published their correspondence to corroborate his account. Dirkmaat assumes Higby and Robinson were biased because they gave negative testimony about Joseph Smith. However, Robinson withdrew from the church because of what he had learned about Joseph Smith's proposal to Nancy. At what point did he suddenly become biased? That seems circular to me, and a convenient way to dismiss all negative testimony. Needless to say, that's not a valid historical methodology.
Markham was a faithful member who connected Nancy Rigdon to Bennett in an illicit relationship, perhaps in a disingenuous effort to publicly exonerate Smith. Robinson was a Rigdon family member who defended Nancy Rigdon's honor and Bennett's version of events and who had recently been estranged from and then cut off by the church.
Markham was immediately contradicted by Nancy's family and friends, threatened with a lawsuit, and his statement was retracted. Markham's accusations that Bennett and Nancy were involved in sexuality had no evidence and no credibility. Robinson, on the other hand, reported what he learned from Nancy and witnessed himself. Robinson announced his resignation from the church in a 12th of July 1842 letter published in the Quincy Whig on the 23rd of July. As mentioned, his estrangement from the church was a result of things he had learned about Joseph Smith. One cannot then turn around and use that to accuse him of bias against Joseph Smith. This is circular reasoning. We are all familiar with companies that fire whistleblowers and then accuse them of being former disgruntled employees.
In any case, Bennett's later admission that he was involved in an affair with an unnamed woman in Nauvoo allows for at least the possibility that Nancy Rigdon was in fact that woman.
Wow, this is a bizarre and irresponsible statement from a historian. There is nothing to justify this speculation. The accusation made by Stephen Markham was debunked at the time. It seems Dirkmaat can't help but perpetuate Joseph Smith's slander of Nancy. Dirkmaat spends a great deal of time discussing the mystery of why the happiness letter was included in the history of the church. He doesn't have an answer, but notes that Willard Richards originally intended to include Sidney Rigdon's letter reporting Joseph Smith's denial from the WASP, which was ignored and then replaced by the happiness letter, copied from Bennett's publication and without an introduction. Dirkmaat can't imagine any legitimate reason for its inclusion, like maybe Richards, who knew the truth of the letter's origin, instructed them to do so before he died in 1854. His goal is to weaken the implied authority of the letter's publication in the history of the church. So he isn't motivated to find a legitimate reason. Dirkmaat doesn't seem to understand that when Richards created the rough draft for the 1842 period in Nauvoo in the spring of 1845, polygamy was still being denied. So it makes sense that he would skip mentioning the episode with Nancy and feature Rigdon's statement about the happiness letter, although he knew it wasn't true. When Thomas Bullock scribed the August 1842 portion of Book D1 of the manuscript history, between the 5th of May and 1st of August 1845, he skipped Sidney Rigdon's denial from the WASP entirely. So why didn't Bullock include Rigdon's denial, as Richard's note in the draft had instructed? That note reads, see Sidney Rigdon's letter for account of his daughter Nancy, WASP, page 79. This is different from the method he used when he wanted to quote sources, which can be seen in the previous sentence. He quoted the phrase where he wanted the transcriber to begin, then put in parentheses the reference, in this case, Law of the Lord, pages 187 and 188. Then he included the phrase where he wanted the transcriber to stop. The reference to Sidney Rigdon's letter says, see Sidney Rigdon's letter, etc., which probably confused Bullock, who left a blank line and then just kept writing. Dirkmaat asserts the following.
In late November 1845, Bullock read the manuscript contained in this volume to both George A. Smith and Willard Richards, and there is no notation in Volume D1 next to the August 27th entry suggesting that any information needed to be inserted at the time of that reading.
But this is incorrect. At some point, a line and a half of penciled text was squeezed into the blank space Bullock had left between the 27th and 28th of August 1842 entries, which was subsequently erased and replaced with a note, see addenda page 3, in Leo Hawkins' handwriting. Hawkins then copied the happiness letter into the addenda, probably in early August 1855, 3 years after the public announcement about polygamy was made. These erased lines are illegible, but conceivably they could have contained instructions that prompted Hawkins to make the insertion. The erased note could have also contained instructions for the scribe copying the text into Book D2 to leave it blank. That scribe was Wilmer Benson, who left a half a page blank at the same location in Book D2, sometime between the 29th of November 1845 and the 2nd of January 1846. Subsequently, on the 6th of November 1855, Bullock finally copied the happiness letter into the blank in Book D2 with closely written lines that ignored the margins with 2 lines to spare. The tightness of the entry doesn't necessarily mean that the space was intended for the shorter denial letter, as Dirkmaat implies. Other blanks were similarly filled with tightly written texts. As mentioned, Book D1 was reviewed by Bullock, Richards, and George A. Smith in late November 1845. Typically, revision notes were kept on a separate piece of paper, but they are not extant for the first part of D1. As you can see in the notes for the latter part of D1, they would have included dates and instructions. So we have two possible methods by which the happiness letter could have been introduced while Richards was alive. Additionally, Richards probably told Bullock and George A. Smith the truth about the origin of the happiness letter and his involvement, which factored into the decision to replace Rigdon's letter reporting Joseph Smith's denial with Joseph Smith's letter to Nancy. If not in November 1845, then later in Utah. This is the only reasonable explanation. Swapping Rigdon's denial letter for the happiness letter was justified, though it lacked an introduction that could have cleared Bennett and harmed Joseph Smith's reputation. This decision seemed aimed at preserving Joseph Smith's authentic teaching while avoiding controversy. Despite Dirkmaat's incomplete account, the happiness letter's inclusion in the history of the church supports its authenticity. Because polygamy skeptics reject the claim that Joseph Smith proposed to Nancy, they cannot allow Joseph Smith to have authored the happiness letter. In a 2023 video, Rob Fotheringham outlined 9 reasons for rejecting the happiness letter.
There are at least 9 issues with the attribution of the happiness letter to the prophet Joseph. First, the story originated with John C. Bennett, a known liar and enemy of the prophet Joseph.
As previously discussed, the letter didn't originate with Bennett, he was only its publisher. Evidence shows that the letter existed before it came into Bennett's possession, and that Higbee delivered it to him in the presence of Robinson. So it doesn't matter how bad one thinks Bennett was.
2, there is no physical copy of the letter to examine for clues about its provenance.
Sure, we don't have the original letter, but no one denied that it was in Willard Richards' handwriting. Not even Richards, likely because the letter could be produced. Sidney Rigdon's letter to the WASP confirmed that his daughter had received a letter, purportedly from Joseph Smith, which is why he had to deny he authored it.
Third, the letter wasn't dated.
We don't know if the original letter was dated or not, but a date is not necessary for it to be authentic. I'm sure there are examples of undated letters.
Fourth, the contents of the letter weren't addressed to anyone.
Because we don't have the original, we can't say it wasn't addressed to Nancy, but it was hand delivered to Nancy by Willard Richards.
Fifth, Joseph's signature or even name weren't included in or used anywhere in the anonymous letter.
We don't know that either. If it were unsigned, it would have been for obvious reasons. No doubt Richards identified Joseph as the author.
Sixth, John C. Bennett claimed the letter was in the handwriting of Willard Richards.
Bennett was told it was in Richards' handwriting. Nancy apparently knew it wasn't Joseph Smith's handwriting and implied she knew who it was. John F. Olney, who was an elder and an officer in the Nauvoo Legion, published the following statement in the Sangamo Journal on the 23rd of September, 1842.
The letter published purporting to be from Smith to Miss Rigdon was not in Smith's handwriting, but in the handwriting of Dr. Willard Richards, who officiated not only as scribe but postboy for profit, and who did say that he wrote the letter as dictated by Joseph Smith, and said Joseph Smith did say on a certain occasion that he did direct said Richards to write a letter to Miss Nancy Rigdon. And I now say I stand ready to prove these allegations by as respectable witnesses, as can be produced in Hancock County.
Seventh, Sidney Rigdon claimed the letter had not come from the prophet Joseph, and through her father, Nancy Rigdon publicly denied that the letter came from Joseph.
This is not exactly right. Nancy didn't deny the letter came from Joseph Smith, only that he didn't write it and it wasn't in his handwriting. And Sidney only repeated that Joseph Smith told him he wasn't the author of the letter, but he didn't say whether he believed him or not. As mentioned, Joseph Smith had to deny authorship of the letter to maintain his first lie that he didn't propose to Nancy, as well as his second lie that he had proposed to Nancy only to test her virtue. Joseph Smith thus denied authoring the letter, but not the proposal. While Fotheringham uncritically accepts Joseph Smith's denial about the letter, one needs to consider the context of the denial to assess its credibility, which is extremely doubtful.
Eighth, Joseph Smith's brother, Apostle William Smith, declared publicly at the time through his Nauvoo newspaper, The Wasp, that Joseph was not the author of the letter.
William Smith gave no reason for his denial, so we don't know how much respect to give it. He had no choice but to deny Joseph Smith's authorship of the letter, since the Wasp was also falsely denying Joseph Smith's polygamy and slandering anyone trying to expose him.
Ninth, church history was changed years after Joseph's death to legitimize the letter.
The church history wasn't changed. It was in the process of being composed when it was decided to print the letter instead of denying it. The most likely reason was that Willard Richards, who knew the truth about the happiness letter, made the change, probably with Brigham Young's support.
If you're interested, this well-researched paper written by an assistant professor of church history and doctrine at BYU identifies issues with the so-called happiness letter.
The weakest aspect of Dirkmaat's article is his excessive reliance on the forgery theory. The only evidence linking Bennett to forgery dates to 1844, but the circumstances surrounding that case were entirely different. Dirkmaat's speculation that Bennett forged the happiness letter is contradicted by the provenance that Bennett provided, which was supported by independent statements from Higbee and Robinson. To dismiss this evidence, Dirkmaat makes the unfounded claim that Bennett may have also forged Robinson's letter to New York newspaperman James Arlington Bennett, or that Robinson conspired with Bennett to fabricate the provenance for the happiness letter. This is merely a desperate attempt to escape evidence that challenges his theory. If Bennett had forged the Robinson letter and published it, it is difficult to believe that he would have remained silent. This is a significant flaw in Dirkmaat's article. The numerous allegations brought by the Mormons against Bennett, Nancy, Robinson, and Higbee may obscure what remained unaddressed. Although Joseph Smith and his associates attempted to refute Bennett's credibility, no individual disputed the claim that Smith had proposed to Nancy, nor did they challenge the accounts provided by Higbee and Robinson. The silence likely stems from the fact that Smith initially denied but later admitted to proposing to Nancy, offering the rationale that his proposal was intended as a test, an explanation that has been met with skepticism. Given this context, Joseph Smith had to deny authoring the happiness letter, which isn't credible either. Despite the feverish attempt to discredit Bennett and the letter, Willard Richards never denounced the claim that he had written and delivered the letter to Nancy. Polygamy skeptics like Fotheringham, who used Dirkmaat's article, should consider his concluding statement regarding the historical evidence.
The preceding does not demonstrate conclusively that the happiness letter was not authored or dictated by Smith, but it does require the careful historian to seriously question Bennett's version of events. Smith may have in fact authored the letter and have done so to persuade Nancy Rigdon to accept plural marriage as part of his larger efforts to practice clandestine polygamy in Nauvoo.
This is followed by a series of unlikely explanations of the happiness letter's contents aimed at weakening the pro-polygamy interpretation without denying Joseph Smith's authorship.
He also may have authored the letter to convince her that it was wrong in the eyes of God to engage in sexual relations with men to whom she was not married, as the Hyde explanation might indicate, perhaps even including Bennett.
Dirkmaat bizarrely tries to argue that the happiness letter possibly has the opposite meaning than what everyone has interpreted. Instead of trying to persuade Nancy to enter into polygamy with him, which she believed was an abomination, Joseph Smith was trying to talk her out of sinning with Bennett. This simply makes no sense. If such were the case, why would Joseph Smith try to distance himself from the letter? The letter argues that what is considered abominable is permissible through special revelation. How does that pertain to reforming promiscuous behavior? The letter attempts to justify behavior thought to be abominable, not condemn it.
Smith also may have authored it for Bennett himself in order to chastise him for engaging in spiritual wifery without the Lord's, or Joseph's, consent.
This is also nonsense, since the letter was handed to Nancy and was produced when the family confronted Joseph Smith before it was given to Bennett. His response was to deny that he wrote the letter because it substantiated Nancy's claim.
Smith may have written it for another person under different circumstances entirely, and it was just misappropriated to help prove Bennett's gratuitous claims.
Dirkmaat is only trying to cloud the issue with meaningless and absurd speculations. He seems to want any interpretation of the evidence other than the one that makes the most sense.
It is also possible that the letter may have been authored by another individual, perhaps even Bennett himself, who was clearly not above forging a Joseph Smith document to suit his purposes. But in any case, using Bennett as both the source and context of a document that no longer exists is highly problematic at best.
Bennett wasn't alone in providing the context of the letter. Sidney Rigdon's letter to the WASP confirmed that Nancy had received the letter. John F. Olney named Willard Richards as the scribe and deliverer of the letter. Higbee and Robinson verified the letter's existence before they conveyed it to Bennett. Bennett's 1844 forgery can't justify a baseless theory that he also forged the happiness letter. I'm Dan Vogel. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.